I'm pleased to introduce Rob May today. Rob is a venture partner at PJC and the co-founder and CTO of Dianthus, a PJC portfolio company. Rob has expertise in the areas of AI, hardware, B2B, and SaaS. Prior to joining PJC, Rob was the co-founder and CEO of Tala, an AI and automation platform transforming the way businesses delivered customer support. He was also the co-founder and CEO of Backupify, the world's first cloud-to-cloud backup provider, which was acquired for over $100 million. As an angel investor, he's made over 70 early-stage AI investments. And I guess in his spare time, he also writes the world's most popular newsletter on artificial intelligence, Inside AI. With all of that, I'm pleased to welcome Rob May.
Hey, Erica, thanks for having me. Let me share my screen here. All right, can you guys see my slideshow?
Looks good.
All right, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A or the chat or however we're doing it here, and I'll answer them as I go along because I don't have a ton of slides and I'm just gonna tell you some stories. And when they asked me to talk about, so my focus is AI, so I do have one slide on AI and scaling that and what that'll look like. But when I was asked to talk about scaling companies, I thought about a lot of the presentations that you probably hear normally and how I could do something that might be different. So I decided to talk about three things that people overlook sometimes when they're scaling. So I'm going to talk about scaling talent, scaling diversity, and scaling communication in your companies because I think people think about go-to-market, they think about product, they think about those kinds of things. So hopefully this will be a little bit different. So you heard a little bit about me. I got my start as an ASIC and FPGA designer, did a few companies. My first company had a good exit back when $100 million was a lot of money, which it's not anymore for, if you don't build like a decacorn, it doesn't even matter. So who knows? Then after my second company, I went in to become a partner at a venture firm for a while, did all our AI and robotics investing. I did about 11 or 12 deals while I was there. I've done about another 80 to 90 personally over the last 6 years. And then I left to start this company called Dianthus, which maybe I'll tell you about if we have time, which is a machine learning and e-commerce company. We've scaled pretty quickly. We're about a year and a half old and we're about 90 to 100 people and $15 million in revenue. So I have learned a lot and it's like really painful to grow really fast sometimes, even though it's a lot of fun. So let's talk about scaling talent, because I think this is one of the hardest things to do. It's hard to hire and it's hard to get talent to work together. And so I have a few ideas that I've learned along the way. I should also mention Backupify got acquired by this company called Datto, and Datto was, we were about 90 people when we got acquired. Datto was about 400 people. So the combined company went like 500 to 700 the year I was there. So we continued to have we launched our products. Part of my job when I got there was to take all the products from both companies and launch them in Europe and Asia Pacific. And so all that kind of scale, is different from what I'm going to talk about today, but I did learn some of these lessons when I was there. So one of the biggest things is, everybody talks about rock stars and you got to build your company on rock stars. But one of the things that you find is people have different definitions of what's an A player. And it depends on what your company is, because you'll talk to all these startups and they're like, oh, we got this team full of like rock stars and A players. And you're like, how does everybody have all the A players? But A players for one company might be C players at another company, right? It depends on what your skill set is, what you're doing. And there's a really good book called Radical Candor. It was written by a woman who worked at both Google and Apple, and she spends a lot of time comparing and contrasting those cultures, which are Google is a ready, fire, aim culture, and Apple is a measure twice, cut once, kind of culture. So very, very different. And she talks a lot about Steve Jobs had this idea of like, look, not everybody needs to be a rock star. Like if you hire everybody who's just like up and up and I'm going to be a VP and I'm going to be a CEO and like whatever, it's like those people don't always get along. So it's not just about rock stars. You need a lot of rock solid people. Sometimes you need people that just want to master their craft and they don't want to be managers. They don't want to be leaders. They just want to get better and better and better at finding all the edge cases and mastering the stuff that they do. So as you start to scale your talent acquisition, it's not just that you have to look for these people, but you have to train everybody else to look for this. And it's like, look, not every engineer that comes in needs to have, 4 patents and a PhD and 2 side projects and some of that. Like, you need some people who just really, really love fixing bugs. And there's a certain type of personality that just really kind of gets satisfaction from that, which leads to my second point, which is team chemistry matters. So as you're scaling, people tend to hire a lot of these same types of people sometimes, or a lot of the types of people that were there in the beginning. But to balance your teams as you're starting to scale, you need to think about different vectors of what you need in people. So you need some people that are like, go, 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 go. And you need some people that are like, wait, 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 are we doing this right? And you need to create that healthy tension between those people to make sure that you don't delay products unnecessarily for, to get that last 1 or 2% of perfection out, which is usually the wrong thing for a startup. But also that you don't have people that are just throwing out crap and moving on because they just want to go, go, go and get on to the next thing. And so hiring people that balance each other out on teams like that, you need some people that are willing to say the emperor has no clothes, because a lot of people won't say that in an organization, and they need to say, I don't think this is working. And those people rub some people the wrong way because some people don't like that they pointed out the thing that everybody was thinking, or maybe that nobody was thinking. And you need other people that are peacemakers and can smooth over things when there's debates and discussions and stuff like that. So think about all these different things when you balance the team. Also think about their skill sets, kind of what I went back to. Some people like to start with a blank slate and build. Some people are terrible with a blank slate. They don't know what to do. They like to take something and tweak it and optimize it and make it better and better and better. And then you need different types of communication styles. Some people are very aggressive. Some people are very assertive. Some people are very passive. Some people are pretty direct. Some people are not. Some people like to write. Some people don't. And you need to balance all these kinds of things. You need some people on the team who can lead discussions. You need some people on the team who can do some of this. And so, who can write well or make presentations well for whatever team that you're on. So your first 5 or 6 or 7 hires, you might not be thinking much about team chemistry. You just need certain functions filled. But, the way this translates into back to the rock stars question is sometimes you might say for a team as you're starting to scale, well, I know this person's a better programmer or this person's a better marketer in the pure technical sense of that job. But the second person is pretty good, but actually has better communication skills, better writing skills, and you're going to need that, right? You need to build a solid foundation. So once you have your core, your first 10, 12, 15 people, then you build your foundation, which needs to be diverse and balanced. Then you can really start to scale from there and lean in on different things. But with all this, you need to do what I have this saying that I call all my teams hear this story that we call push on the hamstrings. And where this comes from is, I once worked in this totally non-technical business with a guy who was a record-winning world-class college track coach. And his track school, his group came under investigation for people are saying like they're winning so many things. They must be doping, they must be using some kind of performance-enhancing drugs. And I had the chance after working with him for a few weeks, it was just the 2 of us late at night one night at this event. And I was like, okay, like just tell me what's going on. Like, did you do all this? Did you just, give your people like drugs? Like, he's like, to my knowledge, nobody on my team ever took anything. It was inappropriate. It's like, how did you win all these championships on all these different fields? And he said, well, if you're a naturally gifted runner, like if you were just born with incredible hamstrings, just genetically gifted hamstrings, and you can run fast, and you come to most college track coaches, they'll say, wow, your hamstrings are great. Let's focus on your quads and your calves and like all this kind of stuff. And I'm going to give you exercises to do that, try to balance you out and everything else. And he said, I would sit there and I would say, if we push on those hamstrings with some exercises, how much could they take and how much better could you get? And part of the reason you want to balance teams across different functional skill sets is because I don't believe everybody needs to know everything. I don't believe everybody needs to become a great public speaker and everybody needs to become a great writer. The people that want to, you should definitely encourage that and help push them along. But I think balancing the team while continuing to push on the hamstrings, both for the people and for what the team is good at. If you're building a company, like if you're building a clothing company that's very much environmentally friendly is your thing, like those are your hamstrings that you need to push on. You do need people that come in to care about that and think that kind of thing is important. So that's a story I tell a lot. And Peter Drucker, who some of you may have heard of, is a famous older management theorist, and he had this saying that you don't worry about compensating for people's weaknesses individually, but push on their strengths, put them in positions to do whatever it is that they do really, really well. And then my final thing, when you start to scale talent, is focus a lot on behavioral interviews and not so much on the technical aspects. If you have a technical team of 20 people, not everybody needs to know the best solution to the traveling salesman problem or some crazy algorithm. If you have one or two people that can do work like that, you need a lot of other things. And I think hiring for attitude or hiring from people that may have worked really hard on something. Actually, I think hiring for somebody who hasn't done exactly what you needed done, but has worked in another related domain can be great, because they can probably pick it up quickly, and sometimes they'll bring new creative ideas, because they look at this sort of tangentially. Performance isn't 100% technical acumen. And then I always tell the people, be the Chris Essler of your industry. So Chris Essler was this guy who worked for me at my first startup, who was our head of sales. It's my fourth head of sales. So it took a while to get that one right. But Chris was so good that people in Boston, where I'm based, just wanted to come work for Chris. Like, they didn't care what we were selling or what the company was about. Like, they just thought, Chris will make me better. And so we didn't have to spend a lot on, we didn't say, wow, have you sold SaaS software tools at our price point in a company of this size or whatever? We looked like, do you have the right attitude, and do you have the right personality characteristics? And if so, we can teach you all that other stuff. And Chris Essler was a master of this, and has had lots of success building lots of sales teams with that model. And so that's the kind of company that you can build, where you look for a certain type of behavioral person. It actually makes running your teams easier when you have people bought into a certain philosophy of how you work and what work means. So my first point. My second point is scaling diversity. This is one of the biggest things that so many technology companies struggle with, because everybody wants to, everybody's like, we want more female engineers, we want more, minorities in our data science and engineering and product positions. And I'm actually have a lot of experience with this, because in my first company, we looked around and we were 20 white guys and one white woman. And one of the executives was like, hey, we should probably start thinking about diversity at this point. And then you get in this whole debate about what that means. And it was a lot of work to start to build a more diverse team. So when I started off with my second team, I'll jump to this middle part here. I spent a lot of time in the early days hiring, making sure the first hires were diverse. So really flipping over rocks, looking around corners, digging into companies that you might not normally go to try to find, a more gender and racially balanced team. Because what happens, to my second point, people know people like them. Women engineers are more likely to know other women engineers. It makes your recruiting easier once you do that. So if you can make that core diverse, it does a couple of things for you, those first hires. Number one, it becomes easier to scale because people know people like them. But the second thing is it makes it more comfortable when people come to interview and there's like, oh, there's people like me here, right? If you walk into a room and everybody looks the same except you, regardless of your race or gender or whatever, like it feels a little bit weird. And occasionally some people are fine with that, but you'll lose some really great candidates if you don't have that. So diversity has sort of that double benefit. Now, I'll go back to this first point. I am not a fan of most diversity programs, because I'm an investor in a company started by a Black woman who worked at Google. And she was a recruiter, and she came out and she created this firm where she specializes in diversity hiring. So she runs tech events in Boston and a few other cities around things like women in engineering, Latinos in data science, like whatever kinds of events like that. And then she compiles these lists of people, and then she goes to companies and she's like, look, I do events for all kinds of groups. And if there's certain types of people that you really want to balance out your team, I can help you find and recruit the good ones. And so as an investor in this company and somebody who used the company, I was frequently in the early days a reference call for big companies. I mean, GE, big companies in Boston, Akamai, places like this. And so I talked to almost every head of diversity of every publicly traded company in Boston at some point. And they would all tell me about why they needed diversity, and I would say, great, Melissa and her company can deliver it. I've seen it. And I would follow up 6 months later, and almost none of them made any progress. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, right? People put these programs in place and they feel good, but they don't actually work. We had this issue in Boston where, I don't know how many of you know the city of Boston, but like sometimes it's a really big pain in the ass to get to certain places in the city. And when certain groups of people cluster, like a lot of immigrants come to Boston for educational reasons, and they cluster in parts of the city. So we have like a really large Nigerian immigrant population. And if you can get into them, they have a lot of like engineers and people that come here to study like engineering and data science. And so if you can get a couple of like Nigerian engineers, you'll see all of them when they switch jobs, and they're like fantastic people. But if you're in certain parts of the city, it's like really hard for them to commute to if they live in the core. I mean, some of them live in different places, but a lot of them live in that core sort of Nigerian area of the city. And so there's a whole bunch of reasons that like this and culture fit that I've seen these people, they'll screen people out and they'll say, well, we talked to a bunch of minority candidates, but they weren't a culture fit. And I always remind people like, yeah, but it's about the diversity of thought experience, right? Like if you're going to take a Black female engineer who grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts and went to MIT and then Stanford, like, I'm not sure how differently she thinks about the world than I think about the world. But the problem with a lot of these programs is, if you grow up in like, so like one of the, poor neighborhoods in Boston is called Mattapan. If you're born in Mattapan and your mind just takes to computer science, right? You just get it. And you're self-taught and you go to University of Massachusetts and your parents just think it's great that you've got a college degree and you're working in the IT department of a restaurant chain like Cheesecake Factory, like that resume, you might be brilliant. That resume is never going to get you an interview at a tech startup. Because people are looking for like their criteria for diversity is just like, you still have to have gone to MIT or you still have to have gone to Stanford. And there's a lot of smart people that didn't go to those places, and there's smart people everywhere. And I think really putting in the effort to find them early matters. So how can you do this? Some things that I've seen that work. I train my teams on culture add versus culture fit, because what you always say is, or what we always say is, will this person add to the culture? Will they be a positive addition? Not, are they like us? We don't want to think about like, look, we're certain types of people and we like Star Wars instead of Star Trek and, whatever, I don't know. But people use these weird things as proxies, right? It's like some of your early people are all into, rock climbing, and suddenly they don't like anybody who doesn't share their love of rock climbing. Like, who cares? So like, you need to make sure that they're a culture add, and you're looking for people that bring new things to the culture. So that's important. I make everybody that works for me, when we post a job, I say I want 10% of your candidates to specifically, that you interview, specifically not meet the job description, which sounds like, why would we waste our time? And sometimes you do. But this does two things. Number one, it helps you screen candidates who come in, who may have mediocre resumes, but are awesome people, but don't have great resume writing skills or don't keep their LinkedIn profile updated. So sometimes you'll see somebody be like, well, this resume is kind of mediocre, but okay, like I need my 10% of people that don't meet my standards. So they come in and they blow you away in the interview and you're like, wow, you're fantastic. The second thing is it tells you if your job spec is right. Like if you're like somebody has 7 years experience in, database administration, and you have somebody come in, you're like, this person looks interesting, and maybe they're a minority candidate or something, and they only have 3 years, and you come in and you're like, wow, their answers are as good as anybody else, then maybe you don't need 7 years, maybe you just need 3 years. So don't set a bunch of artificial bars, or if you do, poke around the edges of those bars, right, and make sure that you're actually setting the right bars. And then again, never lower the bar who you're hiring. That doesn't do anybody any good. But just remember that like some people don't interview well, or some people aren't great resume writers. And so taking a multifaceted approach to how you interact with people and how you recruit, and not assuming that like, well, the process that you went through or the way that you would like to be interviewed is what's best for everybody. People are very different cognitively in how they approach the world. And so if you can do these things, you will become a 100-person company with a very diverse and balanced team that'll be better for your company without having to reach 50 people and be like, damn it, we've got this diversity problem. Let's go hire somebody to fix it. It becomes really hard and painful to fix at that point. So number 3, scaling communications. this is the hardest thing in a company as it grows fast, is how do people know the things that they need to know to do their job? Every time you double, your communication architecture breaks, whatever it is. You start and you all sit in one room around a giant table of like 8 or 10 people, and entrepreneurs write blog posts about how dumb big companies are and how like you don't have to have so many meetings and like it's so great. And like the reason it's great is because you've got 8 or 10 people and you all sit there every day. Pre-COVID, maybe not post-COVID, did it in Slack. But so everybody hears every conversation, everybody knows what's going on. You get to like 12 or 15 or 18 people, and you have that first day where you're like, you go to somebody and you're like, well, wait a minute, why are you working on that? Didn't you know this changed? And you're like, oh, you were out that day. Huh. And it starts to happen a couple of times, and you're like, we have enough people now that somebody's sick or somebody's traveling to a conference or somebody's at a customer site or whatever. Like, we don't all sit around one table. We need a different way to communicate. So you start doing, we're going to do a weekly summary email, or we're going to do a weekly all hands, or maybe a monthly all hands. And then the same thing happens. Those eventually break, right? You have every time or we're going to have a weekly staff meeting, and then now you've got too many people and the staff meeting's too long and people check out. So like now you need multiple staff meetings, and they got to roll up to a bigger staff meeting. Every time the company goes from 10 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 80, these are rough numbers. You need to rethink your communication architecture, how departments communicate, how top level executives communicate all the way through the org, and how people know what they need to know to do their jobs. One other way to do this is to train people to communicate well, and put in important, sort of entrance, on that. And so one of the things we do at Dianthus, and I've done this at all my companies, is, oops, these are not the right points I meant to make. These are for a different slide. So I apologize for that. But we do a program where we teach everybody good communication skills. So one of the things you learn being a CEO that some of you may have learned is you learn how to have a lot of hard conversations. You have to fire people, you have to hire people, you have to talk to people about their performance, you have to negotiate between people who don't get along. And so one of the things that we would do is we would go through and we'd say, look, how do you tell somebody, what are the core principles of communication in an organization? Why can you not use passive language? I'll give you a perfect example. The head of marketing comes to the CEO and is like, hey, we're thinking about redoing the website. And you're like, oh, that's cool, that's great. And it's kind of passive, right? We're kind of thinking about it. What you heard as a CEO is, oh, you might redo the website. What the head of marketing just heard is, I got permission to redo the website. It's very important that you stay clear and direct in your work communications. And people don't like to do that because it's like mildly confrontational, but these are the kinds of skill sets that we work on, because if you can solve these communication problems, as you scale, you save yourself so much time and energy in figuring out like, wait, why didn't you know that? People need to know how to talk about when projects are going to be late, all these different topics. And then I'll say, whoops, yes, say it again, many, many times. This is the most frustrating thing about leadership at scale is you're like, wow, I don't know. I must be showing you guys the wrong version. This is wrong too. But anyway, so the yes, say it again, the point that should be in there is, you have to repeat things multiple times, 3, 4, 5 times. So people need to hear things 5, 6, 7 times before they're going to go through and really, really get it and understand it. And you need to encourage people to ask questions. You need to encourage people to come to you, because the communications piece is probably the single hardest thing about scaling a company. So with that said, I will show you one AI use case, since I am an AI person, and I didn't want to make this whole talk about AI, but I do want to talk about the real potential that AI can have at scale in organizations. So I'm an investor in this company, and I won't say what they do because I don't know if I'm supposed to be sharing this graph with you, but on the right side here, you have gross margins. And this was, as you can see, I invested over here in 2016. The graph doesn't even go back here. But when you're thinking about scale, you should think about machine learning and automation, which is my area of expertise, because what you see here is human beings did this task and they created data sets as they did this task. And those data sets were used to automate more and more and more. And so they went from looking like a services company in 2016 2016, 2017 with 30% gross margins to now in 2021, beyond this, they had over 80% gross margins and they look like a software company. So my last point and my bonus point about scaling a company is lean into AI tools and what they can do, particularly the stuff around automation, predictive models, anything you can do to take the burden off people for the cognitive load that they have to bear themselves is going to make it easier for you to scale. So with that, I'm happy to open it up and take questions. We can talk about, this is me, if you want to email me or follow me on Twitter or, check out my email newsletter. This one I have is actually a little more investing and AI focused, but and then happy to talk about this, happy to talk about other stuff. If you're like, hey, I actually want to talk about scaling go-to-market. I actually want to talk about scaling, I don't know, fundraising processes or whatever. Happy to take any questions you guys have. Or you can drop them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or do whatever.
Hey, Rob, maybe I'll pose a quick question to you while we're waiting for something to come in the chat. And it is a bit AI specific, but I know we've talked about it before. How do you recommend that companies market when they have AI in their solution? Because I think it's a little bit different than regular marketing for a tech company. And you've kind of shared some thoughts and wisdom on this with me before. So maybe you could share that with the audience.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because most of the time, if you're going into a crowded market and you're going to resegment your market, sometimes it might be helpful to focus on the AI piece because you need a reason to stand out. But in general, a lot of times I don't think you do. I don't think it helps you market very well. People find it confusing. People are more skeptical. Like, you'd almost be better to say, we have built technology that automates this thing rather than call it AI, because what we see, particularly when I was on the venture side a couple of years ago, it's like everything is AI and a lot of it's not. A lot of it is, and a lot of it's fantastic, but I'm not sure unless you're selling if you're selling a tech product to developers, it might help a little bit more too. But otherwise, I'm not sure that you should. And but what's interesting, what I talk about sometimes, when you do sell an AI product to people, and they buy it for the AI reason, sometimes you have to put in features that we call AI theater. And so the idea with AI theater is sometimes you just have to show them something that looks like it, because sometimes people sign up and like, your AI is so good, you have a machine learning model and it spits out a prediction. They're like, why is this AI? Like, I saw a number, so what? So sometimes you might want to think about even just having like chat bubbles come up and say something to them. People like, even if that's scripted and not AI, they're like, oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? The tool is talking to me. And you're just like, buyers are weird sometimes. So sometimes we have this AI theater stuff. Let's see. So we got a question. Based on your experiences, do you think scaling a company requires the level of investment that means attracting external investment versus scaling from investing cash flow? Yeah, it's a good question. I've seen both models work. I was an investor in a company that recently was so efficient. They started generating a lot of cash and they've been buying out investors, and we still got a good return. It's like 6 or 7 times our investment. So it can definitely happen. I think I think it depends on 3 factors, right? How much investment money you should take and whether you should think about external investment when you're scaling. Well, and first let me tell you, like, so many people on the web are such big fans of bootstrapping, and a lot of times it's because they have to bootstrap. I can tell you that I am familiar, Datto, who bought my first company, they bootstrapped to 30 million in revenue. And they will tell you if anybody had been willing to have given them money, they would not have done it because they would have got further along faster. So, and I know this for some other bootstrap companies I know that also did really well. Sometimes it's like founder incompetence in raising. Sometimes they don't know what to do. They don't have the connections, and they just take a lot longer to get to 10, 20, $50 million revenue marks. VCs have their problems as well, but I don't particularly have a strong preference on whether you should bootstrap or self-finance or take external money. But here's how I would think about it. Number one, do you need the expertise of investors? If you are in tech markets where you think your exit is going to be to sell to Adobe or Google or Microsoft or somebody like that, your VCs are likely to have those connections, which is helpful, and they're likely to help you position for those kinds of things. and they're likely to know a lot of what's going on in those rapidly moving tech markets. So for all the downsides of dealing with VCs, those can be some upsides. The second thing I would think about is, can you raise the money? You know, if you're 19 and you're a college student and you're working in an industry that is run by a bunch of 50-year-old people that have been in it forever and VCs are skeptical, like, you're probably going to beat your head against the wall to raise money. You should probably go heads down and try to bootstrap as long as you can and get some external proof points, because your resume is not what's going to sort of, you know, help you raise. The third thing is, do you need it to win the market? A lot of bootstrap companies might be better for the founder at the end of the day. The company's smaller, but they own more. But they're rarely the companies that win the market and are really, really big. Those companies normally raise a lot of money, from what I've seen. And then the fourth thing is a personal, you know, and lifestyle thing. Like, if you're 25 years old and you have a roommate and, you know, little to no student debt, like, you don't have to pay yourself a lot. You can probably bootstrap or keep investing from your cash flow much easier than somebody who has, you know, is coming out of an executive job at a big company, you know, is 40 years old, has a mortgage and 3 kids, and one's in private school. And so, you know, if you're scaling and thinking about raising fundraising, and you're like, I really need to get back to this lifestyle to keep my, you know, significant other happy or whatever, then you might need venture capital if you need to take a $150,000 to $250,000 a year salary, or you need to hire those kinds of people in, you know, who want to do that. So those 4 things are the framework I would use to think about it. Do I have any tips for pitching to investors? Yeah, a lot of things. Number 1, authenticity. Like, the more that you can come across as who you really are. Matching with investors is a lot like dating. If you don't smoke, like, matching with somebody who smokes and being like, I'm going to convince you to stop smoking and that's how this is going to work, like, it's just not going to work out, right? You're best to just move on. And investors are the same way. If you pitch somebody and they're like very skeptical that your TAM is real, you're probably not going to get them there. Most of the investors who come and end up doing your deal are the people that the minute they hear it, they go, oh yeah, like, this makes total sense based on what I've been seeing. So it's really a numbers game. My first company, we got 4 venture firms across 3 rounds of funding. I had to pitch 67 venture firms to get there. So you just have to keep pitching with people until some of them, you know, everybody has different perspectives based on the companies they've invested in, the market trends they're interested in, their own background. So try to stay authentic. Try to, you know, always be, I would say always be polite, but don't be afraid to push back and question what people say, but be respectful about it. Ask good questions. And, you know, I don't believe, you know, you can find these blog posts online of like, look, you should have these slides and these orders, like, start with the team or start with the problem, or like, and they're all different advice. I would do the pitch that you feel comfortable with. I would do the pitch that makes you feel like you can go in there and answer questions. My one trick here's 2 things that actually, now that I'm thinking about it, that are tips I would give you. Number 1, the more you can get them talking about themselves and the firm, the better off you are. Like, and you can use this in interviews of any kind. The more that you're supposed to be the subject, but you can make the other person, get them to talk about themselves. They'll talk about themselves the whole time, and then you'll leave and they'll say, wow, that person was great. And, you know, they think that because they got to talk the whole time. So, so that's one thing. And the second thing is, if there are a couple of obvious questions that aren't core to the business, but everybody asks, I put those in like an appendix slide, because what it does is when people ask them, you're like, so like, let's say you have a whole model around selling to a certain type of consumer. And one of the questions you get is like, yeah, but are there legal issues around that? Or are you, you know, because it's a cannabis company, or some question like that, you know, you're going to get. You can put that in a slide and be ready to talk about it. Don't address it in the presentation, okay? Because you know people are going to ask it. And if you address it in an appendix slide, it eats up part of your Q&A time. And they feel like you answered one of their questions, even though you knew it was a question that was coming. So don't leave a basic question out there. Like, if you're a SaaS tool and you have no information about pricing, people are going to think you look stupid. But if you have questions that aren't exactly obvious, but are by the time you go through the presentation, I would leave those and not proactively answer them. So cool. Any other questions about scaling or anything related to tech startups? I made a lot of mistakes. So this is your chance to learn about those.
I guess I can ask you, is there one or two things that you wish you knew that you would travel back in time to tell yourself?
You know, when you go into this, well, let me give you a more practical thing rather than more existential thing. Many of you probably are having those moments that you're sitting there thinking, I'd love to get rid of this jerk that works for me, but they're too critical to the team. They are never too critical to the team. I have been through this several times where I thought, I can't fire this person even though they're causing so many problems because like they know this thing that nobody else knows. Every single time I've waited too long and eventually fired them or they've eventually quit, people pick it up really quick and people are normally glad that they're gone and happy to pick up their job. So that's one thing I would think about. Books or resources that you would recommend, I think. So from a classical business perspective, there's this great book that's underappreciated, I think, called Understanding Michael Porter. And it was written by, so Michael Porter is this guy at Harvard who like in the 80s published like the definition of competitive strategy. And the reason I recommend that book is because while generally I don't think classical business strategy is that great of a thing for startups to study, this book boils Michael Porter's strategy down to like 120 pages and really focuses on one concept, which is value chains. And a lot of startup people are so design focused that they always think about like the experience and not the value chain and not just the experience as part of the value chain. So like here in Boston, Dunkin' Donuts is very big. And a lot of people are like, God, Dunkin' Donuts stores are so crappy. Like I would never sit in there and work on my laptop like I would Starbucks. How is that company even alive? And like what you don't realize is they're targeting different people. Dunkin' Donuts intentionally doesn't want you to stay there. They don't like, Dunkin' Donuts is about, you know, you're a construction worker and you go to work early in the morning and you pop in and get your coffee and your donut and you pop out. They don't want you to come sit for hours because you're a, you know, Gen Z entrepreneur and you're going to sit there for 4 hours and have meetings and do laptop work. So they actually cater to different people and their value chains, the choices that they make intentionally reinforce that. Starbucks tries to go in one type of location. Dunkin' Donuts tries to go in another type of location. You almost never see them right next to each other. So this book really digs into value chains. And I think it's something really important for startups to think about, which is you can't be good at everything. And some things aren't strategic. So if you're doing something where everybody else can copy what you're doing pretty easily without changing their business model, then it's not strategic. You may invest there, but don't invest there thinking that your core competency is going to be better support. When all everybody else has to do is also pay support people $2 more per hour, they'll hire better people, put in better tools. Now, there are businesses where support is difficult and support could be your competitive advantage. You know, when you're dealing in complex industries and hiring support people, they need very esoteric knowledge bases to know or something like that. It could be, so don't take it as gospel, but in general, like having the best support is not always going to be competitive advantage. So that book's really good, I think. And then I would also recommend The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz is a great one to read about being the hard parts about being an entrepreneur, the hard decisions you have to make. This is one of my most common discussions with founders is like, I know this sucks, but here's, you know, you got to do the hard thing. You can't always be popular. A lot of people want to be the boss because they want to be well liked. It's the Michael Scott syndrome from The Office, right? Like that's not what being a boss is about. You don't want to be mean to people, but you need to be respected, not popular. So yeah, if I think of anything else, I'll send them to Erica. Another question is, how does internal HR fit into scaling? At what number of employees? What HR roles most valuable? Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it depends. I think it's going to vary a little bit by company. If recruiting is challenging for what you're doing, like if you're recruiting machine learning engineers, I would think about one of my first 10 hires might be an internal recruiter. Because I don't know what the rates in Canada are, probably similar, but you know, if you're going to pay somebody $150,000 a year and an engineer, and to recruit them, a recruiter is going to take 20 to 25% of their salary. So you're looking at $25,000 or $30,000. Well, if you have somebody that can source 3 or 4 candidates a year, they've paid for themselves. Then you end up hiring, and that's all they do all day, which is really good. And they also can give you better feedback. Like, you know, if you have an external recruiter and they call into a candidate and the candidate's like, well, here's why I'm not interested in that company. Then the recruiter's just like, okay, well, I have this company over here. And you don't necessarily get that feedback. Whereas your internal recruiter's like, look, I've talked to 7 people and all 7 of them said they saw what they saw your CEO tweeted blah, blah, blah thing, and everybody thinks you're jackass and nobody wants to come work here. And, you can go try to correct these things. So, so I would think about that. Other things about internal HR, I think having somebody early on who is like, a lot of people hire an administrative HR person as their first kind of thing, somebody who can set up a 401k and define a hiring process and all these kinds of things. And I would actually focus on performance development. I would focus on somebody who likes to build out, onboarding and training, and maybe will reluctantly do some of the administration stuff until you can afford to hire somebody. But I don't think you want any of your first 20 hires to be admin focused people other than maybe a general office admin. So, so I'd think about that when you would hire HR. And then as you really start to scale, if you're in one of those businesses, and this isn't every business, like it's some businesses, there's a big labor pool for you. Most businesses that we're doing in tech probably aren't. But if there's not, and your sort of people operations are really important, I would encourage you not to have that roll up to the CFO or the head of finance like people normally do, but make it roll up to the CEO, put them in the most senior meetings to sort of show the importance of that role and the importance of people. So scaling international with a new industry in multiple countries, any advice? So it depends on where you're going internationally. If you're selling software on the web, most people that are likely to buy it will understand English and kind of be willing to do that. So that's not super hard. Maybe outside of Asia, maybe the place where you have the fewest, market penetration of people who speak English, but even then, plenty of people do, and it's such a massive market that you can probably still grow for a long time without localizing your language. If you have to do different things like let's say you need channel partners, or you have to follow specific rules in those countries that might not be applicable in your home country, then my advice would be, go slow and learn. And the more different it is from your core home country, the more I would likely to find a partner, to use to sell or something like that. If you're going to Asia Pacific and you're in North America, a lot of people don't think about this, but Australia is a great home base and has much more in common, I think, with North America than people realize. And for some reason, we don't think about that, but it's a big market in and of itself. You can penetrate that market, get some employees, get a base, get some distributors, whatever you have. And then they're used to doing business much more so than we are with, Singapore, Taiwan, China, South Korea. So that's something to think about.
Rob, I have a question that came to me in the chat. Question is, what do you recommend to drive the first $1 million in sales for a SaaS product?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I think about launching a SaaS product, and these are not absolutes, there's always exceptions, but in general, your first couple of customers maybe are going to be free because you just need people to try it out and get feedback. Then your first couple of deals you want to close, you're going to give them deep discounts off list price because you just want the names and the customer references, and that's going to be your deals. Like, look, I'm going to give you 50% off, but you're gonna jump on calls with me and be a reference. After that, a lot of it depends on your price point. Get to $1 million selling, $49 a month packages is very different than getting to $1 million by selling, $50,000 or $100,000 a year, enterprise SaaS. But in my experience, I would, I think the key to getting there, so when you're doing the high enterprise stuff, it can sometimes tricky because you get in the sales process and they're interested, and then it takes 3 months to implement it, and then it takes you 3 months to realize they're not using it. And so sometimes you get this false sense that you have product market fit when you really don't. You have product market fit when people are really upset that your tool goes away. So that's something to think about. The biggest, so it really depends. There's top of funnel problems and bottom of funnel problems. If you're not getting the top of funnel that you want, if you're not seeing enough leads to get to $1 million in revenue, then I think you have to do think you have to do press. I think you have to do content. I think you have to do some kinds of community engagement. I would even encourage you to invest in a conference as they're coming back and go set up a booth. But what you need to do is you need to talk to enough people, enough random people that you understand, because you have it in your head. People have this problem and this is how they talk about it. And sometimes they don't. They talk about it very differently in their industry vernacular than you would. And if you come from that industry, maybe you know, but if not, so I would focus on that if it's a top of funnel problem. If you're seeing a lot of people and they're not closing, and that's a different kind of problem, a lot of times it's a process problem. A lot of times if the founders are still closing deals and the founders aren't salespeople, you just don't know how to manage the sales process. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable following up and nagging people. Hire your first salesperson or two. Don't make it a VP of sales. Hire 2 junior people where this is like their second sales job, so they kind of know a little bit of what to do, and they can manage the deals for you and just do all that. And that's usually what's going to get you there, I think, if you have a decent product. Good. Any other questions?
I think that's all of them. I guess any kind of parting last words of advice or wisdom that you'd share? I know we've got lots of our kind of local startups and growth stage companies on the call, and likely a lot of founders. Any kind of final words of wisdom to live by from you before we let you go?
You know, it's good that you guys are hanging out together. Being a founder is really hard. And the people around you in your personal life, your friends and family and significant others and children and whoever else, like a lot of times don't get it. They don't get the stress that you're under. They don't understand why you suddenly have to jump on and respond to an email when it's 8:30 at night and you're all hanging out. And so the more time that you can spend with other founders and develop relationships with people that you can commiserate with, I think the more that you'll get through those tough times. And just remember that, like, I'm an investor in 100+ companies. A lot of the companies that you read about that it seems like things are going so easy for them, they almost never are. Like maybe 2 to 5% of the time that happens. But even the ones that are raising money, you're like, oh my God, they just keep raising money. Like sometimes those are really structured deals and they're really shitty deals. And sometimes they're not as advertised. It's just like, it's almost never as pretty behind the scenes as it looks like in the press. So don't get too swept up in that. Don't get too swept up. But, the standard that you should use is, are we a better company than we were 3 months ago? Am I a better CEO or CTO or whatever you're doing than I was 3 months ago? Like, compare yourself against your own growth. Don't compare yourself against other startups, because every business is different and every market opportunity is different, and it's hard for all of us. And so try to maintain that perspective and not beat yourself up because you're not Elon Musk. So.